Welcome to the Deep Dive. Our mission is simple. Take a stack of articles, reports, commentary, like the ones you sent us, and really pull out the key insights to help you get informed fast.
That's the idea.
So today, we're diving into the public life and, yeah, some notable controversies surrounding California's first Latino U.S. Senator, Alex Padilla. We've got material from different perspectives looking at his career and some specific events, including some really recent stuff from June 2025.
Right. Think of it like we're navigating the news together, focusing on key moments and how they're presented in these different sources. And to really get the context for some of the, intense discussions around Senator Padilla, it helps to quickly sketch out his journey to the Senate, just based on what the sources say.
Absolutely. His background seems really important to his story. The sources, they highlight he's the son of Mexican immigrants, grew up in Pacoima, and his parents, even with limited formal education themselves, they instilled this powerful work ethic and a real value for education.
Yeah, which, led him to MIT. An engineering degree from MIT. It's interesting, the material points out that politics wasn't necessarily the lifelong plan. It was more spurred by the anti-immigrant feeling he saw back in California in the mid-90s.
Proposition 187.
Exactly. Prop 187 in 94. He felt he had to act against rhetoric that seemed, targeted at families like his.
And wow, from there, his political career really took off pretty quickly. Elected to L.A. City Council at just 26, youngest council president, first Latino in over a century, I think.
That's what the sources say. Then he served in the California State Senate. You might know some of his work there, like the plastic bag phase out or pushing for that earthquake early warning system.
Yeah, tangible stuff, statewide issues.
Exactly. Then he became California Secretary of State, again, first Latino in that role. And the sources really emphasize his focus there was on expanding voting access. Election integrity.
Right. That was like automatic voter registration, same-day registration. The sources mention record-high registration numbers under his leadership.
Uh-huh. And that leads to his appointment to the U.S. Senate in January 2021, filling Kamala Harris's seat when she became VP. Then he won his own election in November 22.
Making him California's first Latino U.S. Senator. Big deal.
Mm-hmm.
And in the Senate, the sources note, he's kept focus on things like voting rights, climate, immigration.
Right. He chairs that Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on immigration, citizenship, and border safety. And he's championed legislation trying to create a pathway to citizenship for undocumented essential workers.
Okay, so that paints a picture. A successful climb, breaking barriers, focusing on major policy.
Yeah, a really significant trajectory through state and now federal government. But as the materials you send over show, the success hasn't come without, scrutiny and some real controversy.
Right, and that's where our deep dive really kicks in. Let's get into the first big one highlighted in the sources. This goes back to late 2020 when he was still Secretary of State.
Okay, yeah. This is the $35 million contract for voter outreach. It definitely got a lot of attention back then, and the sources kind of lay out why.
So what exactly was this contract supposed to do?
Well, the reports from the time say his office awarded this $35 million contract. It was for a statewide campaign, basically, to encourage people to use mail-in ballots during the pandemic.
Okay, makes sense given the time.
Yeah, the ads promoted mail-in voting as, I think the phrase was, simple, safe, and secure.
And who got the money? Who got the contract?
It went to a firm called SKD Knickerbocker. And the commentary in the sources, it points out this is a consulting firm with pretty strong ties to the Democratic Party and specifically to Team Biden.
Ah, okay, so I can see where the contention might start. What kind of criticisms popped up about this contract based on the sources?
Well, a big one, especially coming from Republican perspectives in the sources, was this accusation of political bias. There's a quote in the material from the Senate Republican leader at the time, Shannon Grove.
What did she say?
She called it a clearly partisan action using taxpayer money, said it reeked of political bias because of the firm's connections. So the core worry, as these sources frame it, was whether public money was essentially being used for partisan advantage.
And I remember reading something in the sources about whether it was even needed. Did the local election officials want this?
That's another key point raised. Yeah. Reports indicated that county election officials apparently hadn't been consulted beforehand, and they reportedly didn't ask for or feel they needed this kind of statewide private firm doing outreach for them. That definitely raised some eyebrows, according to the sources.
But maybe the biggest red flag highlighted was about the legality of it all. Could Padilla even award a contract like this?
Absolutely. This is a critical detail from the sources we reviewed. The state controller, Betty Yee, she reportedly refused to approve the payment, and the Department of Finance also declined to issue the check.
Wow. What?
The material suggests they basically questioned Padilla's legal authority to spend the money that way. The thinking was apparently that the funds were allocated for individual counties' mail-in programs, not for one huge contract with a private firm for statewide ads.
And on top of all that, there were questions about transparency, right? Like, why wasn't this more public? What was actually in the contract? Why wasn't it cleared with finance or the controller before it was awarded?
Yeah, those questions are definitely prominent in the coverage we looked at. The sources also mention that Senator Padilla's office at the time reportedly didn't respond directly to those specific questions. And it's interesting, Governor Newsom, when he was asked about it, claimed he didn't know about it, even though Senator Grove had apparently sent him a letter outlining her concerns. The sources note the media didn't really press him further on that point back then.
One source you included, I think it's the Sacramento Bee piece, used some really strong language, called it a $34 million asterisk on his record. A costly mistake, driven by hubris, even a scandal.
Yeah, that piece really summed up the criticism well. It reflected the feeling among some commentators that this contract was a pretty significant misstep. It raised these concerns about accountability, using public funds properly, and, especially through that lens of potential political favoritism that the conservative commentary really emphasized.
Okay, so that gives us a clear picture of a major controversy from his Secretary of State days right before he moved to the Senate. Now, let's jump ahead. Fast forward to, just this month, June 2025. A much more recent and, frankly, dramatic event that caught national headlines.
Right. This is the incident from June 12th. Happened in Los Angeles. It was at a press conference being held by the Homeland Security Secretary, Kristi Noem.
And the reports describe Senator Padilla being, physically removed, forced to the ground, handcuffed by security. It's a pretty jarring image the sources convey.
It really is. The context, piecing it together from the materials, seems to be that Senator Padilla was trying to ask Secretary Noem a question. Something about the recent immigration raids and the protests that had been happening in California.
Okay, and this thing blew up immediately, right? With totally conflicting stories, which our sources definitely show. What did Senator Padilla himself say about what went down?
The materials quote him saying something like, "If that's what they do to a United States senator with a question, imagine what they can do to any American that dares to speak up." So he framed it clearly as a concerning use of force against an elected official just trying to ask a question.
And how did DHS and the administration push back, according to the sources? What was their side?
Well, DHS put out a statement, interestingly, via social media, claiming Padilla chose disrespectful political theater. They said he interrupted a live press conference, didn't identify himself, didn't have his Senate pin visible, and that he lunged towards Secretary Noem and ignored repeated commands to back away. The White House also chimed in with commentary in the sources calling it grandstanding and suggesting Padilla didn't want answers, he wanted attention.
Wow. Lunged. That's a strong word. Now, the reactions from his supporters, Democrats, as detailed in the sources, they were immediate and furious, right?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Intense criticism of the security actions. Governor Newsom called it outrageous, dictatorial, and shameful. And he explicitly linked it to the Trump administration's style, adding something like, "Trump and his shock troops are out of control."
Strong words from the governor.
Yeah. Vice President Kamala Harris called it a shameful and stunning abuse of power, saying Padilla was representing the millions of Californians and doing his duty. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer reportedly said watching the video sickened his stomach, condemning the manhandling as despicable, disgusting, it's so un-American.
And House Leader Hakeem Jeffries
echoed that un-American sentiment. Reports also said other Democratic senators were deeply disturbed. One source even mentioned comparisons to a fascist state demanding accountability. They saw Padilla's actions as legitimate Senate oversight.
Okay, so that's one side. Now, contrast that with the reactions from critics and Republicans cited in the sources. Very different take.
Very different, yeah. As documented in the materials, the blame there often fell on Padilla's actions. Speaker Mike Johnson reportedly accused Padilla of charging Secretary Noem, called his behavior wildly inappropriate, even suggested it might warrant censure from the Senate.
Charging her, so countering the lunged claim with another verb implying aggression.
Right. And Senator John Barrasso, while saying he wasn't fully briefed, commented that Padilla should have been in D.C. anyway, not interrupting a press conference somewhere else. The framing from these sources was definitely that Padilla was disruptive, maybe even provocative.
And if you look at the wider public reaction, like in that Reddit thread source, you see this huge range of opinions, right? And lots of arguments about the basic facts.
That thread really captures the polarization. You had commenters arguing about whether he actually lunged, others questioning if security should have known who he was, pin or no pin. Big debate on whether his actions interrupting, walking towards the podium, resisting removal actually justified the response, especially the handcuffing.
So you see these competing narratives playing out in public commentary. On one side, some people echoing the critics, saying Padilla was out of line, maybe it was a stunt, and security just followed protocol for someone being disruptive.
Exactly. But on the other side, echoing his supporters, many felt the security response was way over the top, disproportionate, and really concerning, given he's a senator supposedly doing oversight. It raised alarms for them about executive power, treatment of officials. It just shows how the exact same video footage can be interpreted through completely different political filters.
And the context of that press conference itself seems important, particularly what Secretary Noem was saying, as reported in the sources.
Yes, that's crucial. Secretary Noem was quoted at that press saying DHS and military operations would continue to sustain an increase in LA. And then she added this very pointed line. We are staying here to liberate this city from the socialist and burdensome leadership that this governor and that this major have placed on this country.
Liberate this city.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And the sources connect that kind of rhetoric to the broader administration context, like President Trump's focus on mass deportations and his use of really harsh language about undocumented immigrants, calling them, rapists, murderers, and terrorists, in quotes, found in the materials. That's the highly charged backdrop for Padilla trying to ask about the immigration raids.
So, okay, let's try to get these two things. The 2020 contract controversy and this 2025 arrest incident, they seem to stand out in the sources as these key moments, these flashpoints that really shape public perception and the narrative around Senator Padilla, especially highlighting the criticisms from the conservative sources we looked at.
Definitely. The contract issue, as framed by those critical sources, it digs into those fundamental questions about taxpayer money, right? Potential political favoritism, the need for transparency in how government spends money. It's really about process, oversight, and perceived propriety.
Whereas the June 2025 incident, well, that just ignites a whole different firestorm of debate, doesn't it? Across all the accounts.
Completely different. It's about executive power, the rights, and, frankly, the safety of elected officials doing their jobs. Where's the line between protest or asking tough questions and disruption or resisting authority? How should law enforcement react in these super politically charged moments? And just, wow, the speed at which these events get interpreted and, let's be honest, weaponized into conflicting narratives. It's about confrontation and these clashing views of reality.
So why does understanding these specific controversies and the really different ways they're described in the sources matter for you, the listener?
Well, because they're not just, isolated blips on the radar. They really illustrate these different facets of political life today. You've got the sometimes quiet but really important fights over contracts and financial accountability. And then you've got these incredibly visible confrontational moments that instantly get spun into completely different stories depending on who you ask and which sources you're looking at.
So understanding these specific situations and the different reactions they sparked, as laid out in the materials we reviewed, it just gives you a fuller picture, right? A better sense of the challenges, the criticisms, and the just plain, intense political environment that public figures like Senator Padilla operate in.
Exactly. It shows how specific actions or even perceived missteps, and crucially, how those actions are framed by different groups, can really shape a politician's reputation and public image.
And that brings us pretty much to the end of this deep dive into the sources covering Senator Alex Padilla's background and these couple of major controversies. We've looked at his career path. We've dug into the questions around that 2020 voter outreach contract.
And we've examined the really conflicting accounts and the, frankly, powerful reactions surrounding that press conference incident just now in 2025.
And throughout, we've really tried to just present the information and the various viewpoints we found in the sources neutrally, showing how these events are talked about across the different materials you sent us.
So maybe here's something to chew on as you go. In this era where political events are instantly everywhere, broadcast and filtered through such different lenses, it often results in these completely contradictory stories about what even happened. How do we, as citizens trying to stay informed in this landscape, figure out what's verifiable? And what does all this conflicting narrative mean for accountability and just, the basic functioning of our government?
That is a complex question. and certainly one highlighted by the very different accounts we found in the sources today.